The second Quincy invasion kicks off with two major fights taking place at the same time, focusing on some of the captains who had their bankai stolen by the Sternritter and their struggles to overcome them, using the fruits of their training from the brief interim they were afforded. The first of these battles is one we've already looked at on the channel, Toshiro and Matsumoto versus Bazby and Kangdu. Of the two fights that open the invasion, I'd argue that's the one that takes precedence, while the second fight goes a little undercooked and a little overlooked by comparison. And that fight is of course Soi Fon and OMAEDA versus BG9, which we're here to talk about today. Despite existing in the shadow of Toshiro's bout, this is a cool fight in itself too, and deserves to be looked at. On top of that, this is Soi Fon's only battle in the entire Thousand Year Blood War arc, which does make it a bit of a weird one to analyse holistically, as there's a few additional factors to think about. For example, considering she never gets to fight properly again, is this an adequate send-off for the captain? When compared with some of the other final battles for characters of the Gotei 13, does this one hold up to scrutiny? Well, that's just some of what we're here to look at today, and make no mistake, this is a strange fight. Even compared to its closest counterpart being Toshiro vs Bazby at the time, Soi Fon vs BG9 is brutally truncated, and as a result, I think, features one of the fastest captain defeats I've ever seen in Bleach. While I think the comparisons between both this fight and its contemporaries in the arc, as well as Soi Fon's other fights in Bleach, are crucial, I want this fight to be able to stand on its own as well. I actually think this is quite a unique fight for the series, and in general the second Quincy invasion starts out strong. Stronger than it ends anyway, and this fight is a part of that. BG9, for example, is a fascinating, threatening enigma of a villain, while both OMAEDA and his relationship with his captain get some incredible development in this battle. The spotlight might not shine on the second division for long in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, but it does shine brightly, and I really enjoy their evolved dynamic here. So let's dive into Soi Fon and OMAEDA versus BG9. In some ways, Soi Fon's weakest fight for sure, but in others I think there's a lot to love here, it's just over way too soon. So let's take a look. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video when you're done with it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. If you want to take the support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to say a massive thank you and give a huge shout out to everyone supporting me here over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you all so very much. And yes, there will be some spoilers for the Thousand Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to come. So, right off the bat, I want to return to a comment I made a moment ago about how this is a very unique fight. To be honest, I need to give some praise to both Soi Fon and Kubo's handling of her battles. All three of her major fights, versus Yoruichi, versus Baragon, and finally versus BG9, feel very distinct from one another, which isn't something you can say about every captain. Against Yoruichi, you've got very much the standard Bleach mirror match, and it made for a thoroughly exciting showdown. In my opinion, this still stands tall as Soi Fon's best fight in the series. But Kubo then pivoted hard with Soi Fon vs Baragon in a way that was quite interesting. Where a lot of the Espada fights were those familiar mirror matches, this was the total opposite of that. Soi Fon was a horrible mismatch for Baragon, and she struggled immensely as a result. While I do think Baragon's fight is something of a letdown overall, I'll always appreciate how Kubo put Soi Fon into a corner here. It was very refreshing to see a captain either try and use all of their tricks and fail, or find themselves simply unable to. It's obvious to us as readers why Soi Fon doesn't use her Shikai against the Espada. She simply can't get near him at all, so that presents an intriguing problem for her to try and overcome. And this results in Soi Fon's bankai being revealed for the first time, but even that turns out to not be enough. And then here, against BG9, the fight, what little there is of it, is mostly about showing off Soi Fon's prowess with Shunko and how she's mastered it in the wake of losing her bankai. But unlike Baragon, whose tricky power means Soi Fon needs to keep him at a distance at all times, here against BG9, she simply kind of comes up against a brick wall, and we'll discuss that more as we progress through the analysis. Of course, the nature of BG9's abilities is never truly revealed, but we can make some educated guesses about it that all lead to Soi Fon's complete and utter defeat at the hands of the Sternritter. At least until she gets her bankai back, that is. As I mentioned, this fight runs concurrently with Toshiro vs Bazby, but it is a fair bit shorter overall, and is unfortunately quite broken up. The battle runs from chapter 548 to 553, but in reality, it only lasts for about 2 to 2.5 chapters total, making it quite a bit more compact than Soi Fon's other milestone fights. Of course, this fight doesn't just belong to Soi Fon alone. While OMAEDA has received a bit of development in the past, showing a willingness to try and help his captain on the battlefield despite his cowardice and ineptitude, this fight shows a brand new side of him. This is an OMAEDA that genuinely cares about the fight that's taking place, an OMAEDA who's willing to stand up to his enemy face to face, so to speak anyway, and keep up the struggle no matter how completely outmatched he is, and he knows it. BG9 perhaps isn't as outwardly terrifying as Baragon, but there's one key difference between the two villains. Baragon was characterised by his extreme arrogance, his kingly, laid-back demeanour. He was perfectly happy chasing OMAEDA around for a while, toying with his food, before eventually getting sick of it and deciding to kill him. BG9 is completely different. His mechanical nature is embodied by his cold, calculating ruthlessness and efficiency. BG9 is all business, at least to begin with, and that statuesque, faceless, Terminator-like determination to get the job done is what's truly frightening about him. As what appears, at least on the surface, to be a machine, BG9 isn't shackled by ethics or morals, and you really see that in this fight. So we get some nice development for both Soi Fon and OMAEDA in this short battle. Soi Fon unveils her mastered Shunko, complete with fantastic looking wings of wind, while OMAEDA proves himself sturdier than expected. And to cap it all off, the two of them come together at last to work as a team to defeat the enemy. Honestly, I've said this before, but both Hitsugaya and Soi Fon should have just killed their enemies outright. They absolutely deserved to get those definitive wins. In Soi Fon and OMAEDA's case in particular, they really deserved it for finally shining as an actual captain and vice-captain partnership for once, and BG9 having his face busted open by a missile and surviving never really made all that much sense to me anyway. Alright, so first up, a brief overview of the characters involved in the battle before we get going. Soi Fon, the captain of the 2nd Division and head of the OMAEDA, gets her final fight of the series, though if it were up to me, she'd have joined Yoruichi in Varvelt to take on Askin, but that's another story. It's odd that the OMAEDA have absolutely no presence in the war whatsoever. It would have been cool to see that Soi Fon was still able to command them despite the new terrain, showing how quickly they're able to adapt. In fact, the Raikoben make no appearance here either, despite helping to distribute communication throughout the first invasion. Honestly, I think this is probably down to the fact that the 12th Division basically usurps command in the 2nd invasion completely. But Soi Fon is one of many captains to not actually be in the Seirei at the time of the battle's beginning, having been training in the wasteland way beyond the Seirei walls. As I said before, this is a weird fight for Soi Fon. It's not her best showing by any means, but really it's over too fast to make any kind of a true judgment, as we'll get into. Then there's OMAEDA, who steps up here in a big, meaningful way, and that's mostly thanks to the appearance of his family member Mareyo, who is also technically involved in the battle. Mareyo is OMAEDA's younger sister who was glimpsed briefly in the source material when trying to get her brother to play with her during the intermission between invasions, though she has made other appearances in the anime and the chapter Omakes as well before this point. Involving Mareyo was, in my opinion, a great move by Kubo, as it increases the stakes of the fight for OMAEDA dramatically. Suddenly, this bumbling, oafish man has something very real to care about. It is jarring, though, that OMAEDA's sister is here at all, and BG9 even mentions he senses other OMAEDA family members nearby, but not a single other civilian is ever seen during the invasion. And finally, Sternritter K, BG9 is Soi Fon's opponent in this fight. This is one of a few grudge matches in the second invasion, as these sides fought before in the first battle, where Soi Fon's bankai was stolen from her. BG9, to be honest, was probably the bankai stealing Sternritter we saw the least of in the first invasion. Kubo was keeping him under wraps somewhat, it felt like, so I was always really excited to learn more about this strange armoured Quincy. I initially thought he was supposed to be a knight of some kind, until it quickly became apparent that he was actually a robot. Unfortunately, we don't really learn anything new about BG9 during this fight, and it's a crying shame he ends up being tossed aside to make way for new villains when I feel like he still had a lot to offer. Just watch and see how fast he defeats Soi Fon here. It's a great example of even the most middle ground Sternritter just being on a totally different level to other enemies in the series. But next up, some pre-fight context to detail the lead-in to this fight and how we actually got here. During the first Quincy invasion, BG9 attacks the 2nd Division and is met by Soi Fon and OMAEDA. Soi Fon uses her bankai almost immediately, but BG9 steals it using his medallion. After the battle, Soi Fon trains her body relentlessly in an attempt to strengthen herself to the point where she doesn't need to fight using her bankai at all. I always thought this was a little odd, personally, as Soi Fon detests her bankai anyway and doesn't like using it, to the point where of all the captains that lost them, hers felt like the one that ultimately mattered the least. It's likely though, at least in my opinion, that she simply felt she wasn't strong enough to take on the enemy regardless, and saw losing her bankai, something that belonged to her, as a weakness itself. So when the Vandenreich invades the Seireitei for the second time, Soi Fon is initially nowhere to be found. Still outside the city walls, presumably still training. OMAEDA, however, is caught unaware and watches as his family's manor estate transforms around him, becoming the Quincy city covered in ice. Initially, we're faced with the OMAEDA of old. He's absolutely terrified at the sight unfolding before him, freaking out at the fact that this is happening while Soi Fon is away. He can't simply cower behind her this time, and is faced with the prospect of heading out onto the battlefield all alone. But luckily for him, or maybe not depending on how you look at it, the following encounters would completely reshape him into a much more driven and capable soldier. For OMAEDA is instantly ripped from his terrified state by his sister Mareyo, who has found him amongst the chaos. Mareyo tugs at his arm, and in this moment OMAEDA is reborn. His gaze hardens and focuses, his upper lip stiffens, and he realises what he has to do. In this moment, OMAEDA knows what his job as a member of the Gotei 13 is. It's to protect the Seireitei and all those in it. Finally, seeing his sister's face has seemingly awoken the vice-captain to the responsibilities that come with his position. It's a lovely moment of humanisation for one of Bleach's previously most repugnant characters. Someone who was devoid of responsibility and care, who is suddenly shouldering it in the most mature of ways. OMAEDA earns himself a lot of respect in this battle, in my opinion, and this is the beginnings of that. Mareyo begs him not to leave as she's scared, but OMAEDA says he has to, as it's his duty to protect the Seireitei. Admittedly, it is a little weird that it seems like he's planning on just leaving her alone here in the midst of enemy territory, but we'll overlook that for now in deference to how inspiring his speech was. However, before OMAEDA can go anywhere, someone crashes into the alleyway behind him, and from the thick plume of dust, BG9 emerges, tall and silent. OMAEDA instantly recognises him as the Sternritter who stole Soi Fon's bankai, and the battle is on. After Hitsugaya and Matsumoto seemingly defeat Bazby in the nearby vicinity, OMAEDA is thrown into a stone wall, slamming into it with a hefty crash. His Shikai Gagetsuburi is already active, and at some point between BG9's arrival and now, Mareyo has managed to slip away, perhaps undetected. If you ask me though, Mareyo was likely able to escape because BG9 currently has no interest in her at all, and he doesn't really have much interest in OMAEDA either. The Sternritter is hunting for Soi Fon exclusively right now, and has so far asked OMAEDA where she is twice. With OMAEDA now backed up against a wall, BG9 points a sharp-bladed tendril at the vice-captain and asks him for the third time where Soi Fon is. It is an extremely cool detail that BG9's speech bubbles are all straight-edged to imply he's speaking in a monotone, robotic voice. BG9 mentions that he searched the area using samples of Soi Fon's Reiatsu that he picked up in their last battle, but found no trace of her, even after extending his search to outside the Seirete. This implies that Soi Fon's training area was quite a considerable distance out, as evidenced by, I guess, the mountain that we see her training on earlier. BG9 scanning the area using spiritual pressure samples he acquired also seems to be another hint towards his unknown shrift, which the majority of the community has agreed is likely to be K, the knowledge, or some variation of. While we don't know for sure, I'd interpret this shrift to be pretty simple. Anything BG9 sees or interacts with, he's able to analyse and understand, using that collected data to his advantage. In some ways, it's almost like a much weaker version of the death dealing, in the way anything used against him he can then use to strengthen himself in some way. Here he's using Soi Fon's Reiatsu to try and find her, but later we do get a much clearer example of this power working, which we'll get into. But OMAEDA continues to reiterate that he just doesn't know where Soi Fon is, loudly proclaiming that while most people would try and keep that information safe under interrogation, he's the kind of guy who would let it slip when feeling the pressure, so he really doesn't know. This is quite self-aware for OMAEDA, and it definitely feels like he's braver here than he is when he faced Baragon. But like I mentioned earlier, I'd argue Baragon is definitely scarier than BG9, initially at least. OMAEDA then even goes so far as to mock BG9 to his face, telling him that even if he did locate Soi Fon, she'd never lose to someone like him anyway. It's at this point that BG9 decides to change tactic, and the battle takes a dramatically darker turn. BG9 fires a tendril straight into a nearby building, piercing the wall with ease, before lifting something out through the ceiling, smashing the rooftop to pieces. OMAEDA wonders what this guy's up to when he suddenly catches sight of something in the air. Mareyo has been skewered on the end of BG9's tendril and is now dangling high in the sky, blood running from her mouth. This is a horrifyingly grisly and shocking moment, but in my opinion it is brutally effective as well, and sets up OMAEDA's character for the remainder of the fight. I love that Kubo just uses a blank black background for OMAEDA's reaction when he realises what's happened. It's so perfect at conveying that sudden change in tone. There's no more joking around or buffoonery to be had here. Like a switch being flipped, OMAEDA is suddenly out for blood. Or oil, I guess, here. Either way, BG9 holds Mareyo's body up in the air as she slowly calls out to her brother. It's also kind of brutal to think that she went smashing through the ceiling of that building as well when BG9 hoisted her out. In my opinion, this scene is the equivalent of Baragon managing to snag Soi Fon's arm with Respirar at the start of the fight. Not only is it terrifying, but it completely upends the battle and alters the trajectory of the entire fight moving forwards, and BG9's callous disregard for the life of a child in his pursuit of Soi Fon instantly makes him a threat. This is a being who will stop at nothing to achieve his directive. Once again, it's that robotic efficiency, that drive to simply act that made BG9 stand out to me. A lot of Bleach villains simply aren't like this, as evidenced by Soi Fon and OMAEDA's last major opponent. I normally only cover the source material in these videos, but the fight in the anime featured a substantial change here, where Mareyo never actually leaves OMAEDA's side, and when BG9 turned to strike her, OMAEDA took the hit instead. As I mentioned in my review of the episode, it's difficult to know if this was some form of censorship, or if the anime simply wanted to change how OMAEDA was perceived. And while I appreciate how valiant and fast the new scene makes him look, the impact is definitely lessened overall, and I prefer the source material's version of events. Again, demonstrating his inhuman deduction, BG9 notes that while Mareyo's physical similarities are low, they have a Reiatsu match of over 50%, designating them as relatives. BG9 also notes that there are 3 other individuals nearby with the same match ratio, and they will all die the moment OMAEDA refuses to answer him again. The clinical, statistical nature with which BG9 bargains with these characters' lives is very fitting for what little we know about him. However, in a rather cathartic moment, rather than respond to BG9's request, OMAEDA simply slams Gagetsuburi into the side of the Sternritter's head as a furious OMAEDA demands that that BG9 let Mareyo go. It's cool though that Gagetsuburi barely even moves BG9 at all. Although his head is a little scuffed up, the robot stands tall as the spiked ball and chain drops to the ground. Despite his data and results-driven nature, however, BG9 does seem to be a little vindictive, as he then impales OMAEDA with several tendrils in response to the attack, while wondering if that's another refusal to reply to his query about Soi Fon. BG9 says that if he lets Mareyo go now, she will lose a lot of blood and most likely die, before wondering if OMAEDA is alright with that. OMAEDA swings Gagetsuburi again, but BG9 wraps the chain up in several tendrils, stabbing OMAEDA once more, this time in the opposite shoulder. As OMAEDA's anger continues to boil, however, BG9 wonders if he's simply paralysed from shock, so gives him another 15 seconds to answer. Honestly, looking at this version of BG9 for a moment and comparing him to the snivelling, almost cowardly version we see during his execution scene in chapter 559, it's like they are almost two totally different characters. Here, BG9 is extremely stoic and matter-of-fact. Funnily enough, he's completely and utterly robotic, with no sign of humanity whatsoever. Yet later, he actively fears for his life and pleads with Yhwach to spare them. It's definitely odd. Also, I just have to reiterate once more that this is such a different OMAEDA to what we're used to as well. He's currently impaled by no less than 4 tendrils and staring death in the face, but he's snarling at BG9, determined to make him pay for hurting his sister. Unfortunately for OMAEDA, however, his 15 seconds are up. From within the folds of his cloak, BG9 reveals a colossal minigun adorned with the Vandenreich emblem, which is such an awesome and unique spirit weapon, before aiming it at the vice captain. Interestingly, BG9's minigun seems to be made of the same tendrils that make up his body. In fact, there's definitely some weirdness going on underneath BG9's cloak in general. When the minigun is revealed, all we can see is a mess of tendrils attached to it and nothing else, but it's later shown that these tendrils all originate from inside BG9's central chest plate. OMAEDA roars in defiance as BG9 begins unloading a stream of bullets at the vice captain, a massive flurry of light and power bursting forth as the barrels of the minigun whir and spin around, when suddenly the entire gun is smashed into 2 pieces, BG9 shocked to see the front end of the gun barrels totally broken apart. Neither he nor OMAEDA realise what's happened yet. It's only a few seconds later when OMAEDA catches sight of a surging energy atop a nearby building that he realises. Soi Fon's voice rings out as she says she expected BG9 to use a bow and arrow before revealing herself, dumping the end of the minigun onto the rooftop as she also drops the bullets that she caught from her hand. Soi Fon sarcastically compliments BG9, telling him he's more advanced than she thought. Honestly, this is such an awesome introduction for Soi Fon. Her managing to catch every single bullet from the minigun before obliterating it, all without BG9 noticing at all, is a fantastic testament to both her stealth, her speed, and her power all combined. Of course, her Shunko is currently active. The first time we've seen it in the source material since the Soul Society arc. Surprised, BG9 notes that there was no reading on his sensor whatsoever, to which Soi Fon smirks that a member of the secret remote squad is obviously capable of cloaking their Reiatsu. Considering BG9's data on her, this seems very impressive and makes you wonder how long she's actually been there and how much of OMAEDA's resistance she was able to witness. In the next few panels, BG9 continues to demonstrate his obsession with data and knowledge, reciting Soi Fon's entire title back to her before wondering what her appearance means. Soi Fon muses that with all of his knowledge on her, BG9 should know that this form is Shunko, to which once again, BG9 elaborately details what Shunko is in its entirety before stating that Soi Fon's should still be incomplete. So BG9's shrift clearly revolves around knowledge and information, and it seems like he has an entire database inside him. Honestly, Kubo should have gone the extra mile here and said that BG9 was the Sternritter responsible for compiling the data that the other Sternritter use in their battles. That would have been really awesome. What's odd about this interaction is that Soi Fon mentions she perfected her Shunko after her battle with Yoruichi. If that's true, then BG9 should have already known about it, since the Quincy have been gathering data throughout the entirety of the Bleach story to date. Soi Fon mentions that she had been training with it since that battle and presumably, in the aftermath of the first invasion, found a way to wrap her body in a vortex of wind. This means she can fight continuously while pumping out Shunko. I'd argue personally this is a net improvement and therefore her Shunko wasn't actually perfected until now, but it doesn't really matter. As she says this, she clenches her fist, the energy spiralling around her arm before billowing outwards, taking the form of butterfly wings behind her, which look absolutely fantastic. The sensation of the wings whirring and thundering with the plumage of power is awesome, and Kubo does an amazing job at making it look voluminous and incredible. Soi Fon then notes that if BG9 hadn't stolen her bankai, she might never have improved her Shunko this much. And while again I understand the sentiment, Soi Fon hates her bankai, so I don't see why having it would preclude her from training with something that she would much rather fight with. But Soi Fon appears immediately beside BG9, wind energy rippling around her body as she aims a fist at the Sternritter. Soi Fon reveals the name of this technique, Mukyu Shunko, as a vast amount of energy and power is released from her outstretched arm, barreling into BG9 and, from the image we see at least anyway, seemingly completely decimating him, his entire body overcome by this massive wave of force. BG9 is launched into a nearby building, disappearing within a cloud of dust. However, as Soi Fon turns to walk away, her attack leaving a huge trail in the ground behind her, a sinister eye flickers into life from within the dust cloud, BG9's shadowy form emerging, a crack running down his face. Fun fact, this is one of my favourite cliffhangers in the entire series. It has a very old school feel to it and I absolutely love it. The dynamic angle on Soi Fon's shocked face as she senses BG9 is still alive behind her, the Sternritter's silhouette appearing from the cloud at the end of the shattered alleyway, followed up by BG9's single shadowy bulbous eye shimmering, is such an incredible visual. It's so cinematic, and it's a shame it was removed from the anime's version of the fight. As Soi Fon walks away, she's immediately alerted to BG9's survival, and the Sternritter fires a laser-fast tendril at the captain. However, in another great piece of choreography, Soi Fon leaps over the attack into the air, grabbing the tendril as she goes before flipping over and hauling BG9 from the wreckage using his own strike. Showing a pretty impressive amount of physical strength, Soi Fon, again slinging BG9 around by his own tendril, slams the Sternritter into a nearby tower block. Soi Fon admits that she's surprised to see BG9 is still breathing, but as the Sternritter emerges from the rubble, he utters his coolest line, claiming to have never taken a breath to begin with. His cloak shredded, BG9's form is revealed in full. He's humanoid, but of course, strange looking. His body seems to be made up of purple flesh of sorts, with sections of his body covered in armoured plates. Soi Fon notes that BG9 is a mechanical doll, though I wonder how she really knows what a robot is in the first place. Soul Society's technology is advanced, but I don't recall it being quite that advanced just yet, but maybe I'm misremembering. Still, she correctly notes that he is something Mayuri would probably be interested in. The questions we have about BG9 are endless. Who made him? Why is a robot serving in Yhwach's Quincy army as a Sternritter? If he's not a living being, can he really have a shrift? Unfortunately, we have no idea, though the anime does go a little bit further by revealing that BG9 is full of oil instead of blood. If we compare this battle to Soi Fon's previous outings briefly again, this does feel like more of a mirror match than otherwise, even if it might not outwardly seem like it. Both Soi Fon and BG9 are very direct individuals. They're focused exclusively on the mission and will go to great lengths to succeed. Not only that, but they are both beings who are primarily designed to kill. Soi Fon with her assassin heritage and her two-step kill Zanpakuto, and BG9 seems to have been literally built to kill things, with a vast array of weapons at his disposal. Speaking of which, BG9's armoured plates then flip open, revealing several missiles embedded in what looks like it could be muscle. Maybe BG9 is a cyborg rather than a straight-up robot. BG9 reveals that he's received very useful data as a result of Mukyu Shunko, but he feels disappointed. At Soi Fon's current level, he doesn't feel he has any reason to use the bankai he stole from her. And as he says this, BG9 unleashes his missiles at the captain in a flurry of explosions, lighting up the surrounding area in a massive fireball. Soi Fon manages to escape the blast, darting upwards into the sky as she prepares to reactivate her Shunko, but the moment she lifts her arm, BG9 impales her through the wrist with a tendril, shutting off her power source. The Sternritter then appears right in front of her in the air, telling a horrified Soi Fon once again that he received very useful data from her Mukyu Shunko before a second enormous explosion is triggered, a huge blast rippling through the sky above the battlefield. Going back to an earlier point regarding BG9's shrift, this is in my opinion the most clear-cut moment where we can see him utilising its power. Thanks to witnessing Soi Fon's Mukyu Shunko firsthand and being struck by it, BG9 gathered valuable data on how it works. Presumably the knowledge that a Shinigami's Reiatsu flows from their wrists at all times. So, by stabbing Soi Fon through the wrist, he renders her Shunko useless in that moment. I always wondered if BG9 detonated himself somehow in this scene. In the source material, there's an odd detail of a strange line running down from his eye moments before he explodes, but I don't think that is the case. I imagine simply he's firing another volley of missiles at the captain, only this time he's got her trapped and at point-blank range. We don't now continue with this fight for a few chapters. The next time we see Soi Fon, she's lying unconscious on a rooftop, her body scorched and badly burnt, and she looks close to death. This is what I mean by this being maybe one of the fastest and most brutal takedowns of a captain in an actual battle ever. Soi Fon arrived on the scene, maybe mere minutes ago in universe time. She traded perhaps 2 blows with BG9 before he completely decimates her, and she is basically out of the fight, were it not for Urahara's miracle pill. Had BG9 not decided to try and extract data from her, he could have easily killed her and been done with it in the space of a few minutes. In the same way Kangdu does with Hitsugaya, BG9 goes against Yhwach's orders to end their fights immediately, a transgression that results in the Sternritter's defeats and subsequent demise. However, the next time we see them, BG9 has set up some kind of barrier encircling them both that enables him to conduct his research without fear from a sneak attack from behind. We see him kneeling over Soi Fon's body, hundreds of tendrils emerging from his chest as they probe the captain for information. Suddenly, however, OMAEDA swoops in, managing to snatch Soi Fon from under BG9's gaze, taking her to a separate rooftop. BG9 is surprised to see OMAEDA still resisting despite Soi Fon's defeat, before saying he wished to collect even more data from her before she died. OMAEDA then drops a Shinyaku pill into Soi Fon's open palm, explaining to her that she should be able to use her bankai now as the pill is absorbed into her body, activating. BG9 is unable to hear OMAEDA's whispers as his senses have dulled since the explosion, but suddenly the Sternritter's leg gives way beneath him and he staggers, unable to move from the spot. Trying to deduce what's going on, BG9 realises his connections are failing him. At this point, Soi Fon reawakens, revealing to her enemy that she's hollow-fied herself and her bankai using Urahara's pill, and the hollow Reiatsu is now interfering with BG9's own body. Again, I don't really know how hollow Reiatsu affects a robot unless he's literally being held together by Quincy Reiatsu, which I guess is totally possible. Interestingly, although it's very slight, it looks like a spray of blood bursts out of BG9's knee in this one panel, similar yet much smaller in scope to how Kangdu was affected earlier in the same chapter. From the other rooftop, Soi Fon activates her bankai at last, Jakuho Raikoben, despite her serious injuries. Again, I love this. The visuals are excellent here. Soi Fon is crippled and completely unable to move, covered head to toe in serious burns, but OMAEDA is cradling her and holding her steady, enabling her to lift this colossal missile. This is a far cry from the duo they were in the Fate Karakura Town arc, where OMAEDA caught Soi Fon after she went flying from the blast of her bankai before, and her response was to simply tell him to release her as she found him disgusting. Here though, she orders OMAEDA to hold her steady, and a brave, defiant OMAEDA roars that he will. Unable to move and down on one knee, BG9 barks at Soi Fon, demanding to know why the bankai has returned to her, but in typical Soi Fon fashion, she snidely tells him to analyse it for himself once it hits him, and launches the missile. With BG9 unable to escape, Jakuho Raikoben tears through the sky, erupting through pulsing rings of light and fire towards the Sternritter, who can only look on helpless as it collides with him directly. BG9 disappearing in a calamitous explosion that swallows up the building and the Quincy in an incredible blast, shockwaves rippling across the war zone on impact. Interestingly, this feels like quite a different interpretation of Jakuho Raikoben to when we first saw it, and is perhaps indicative of Soi Fon's training since then. In the fake Karakura Town battle, she needed time to prepare the bankai, strapping herself to a building using a steel sash called a Jinjo-tan first, but even that wasn't enough, and the force of simply firing the missile sent her absolutely flying. Here, she and OMAEDA seemed to be able to remain perfectly stable, and not only that, but using Jakuho Raikoben used to take it out of a mostly healthy Soi Fon. Here, she's able to use bankai even when near death. But that's it for the fight. The next time we see BG9, he's falling through the cloud of dust and debris, a massive bloodied hole in his head and chest. Unfortunately, we never actually see what's inside BG9 despite his face being blown open, and he does manage to survive this despite being hit directly. As I've mentioned before, we later see BG9 resurrect itself using its holy form, and although we see the column of light, the form itself is never revealed. In the anime, BG9 is shown healing itself slowly over time before being collected by Uryu for its failure. Later on, BG9 kneels before both Yhwach and Haschwalth alongside Kangdu, the two of them awaiting their execution. Unlike Kangdu, who remains completely silent, BG9 begs Yhwach not to kill them, telling them that although they were defeated, they're able to continue fighting for Yhwach's sake. However, Haschwalth attempts to kill Kangdu, who blocks the strike using the iron. In the source material, this is the last we ever see of BG9, the robot looking on in quiet horror as Kangdu's defiant last stand plays out. In the anime, after Kang is killed, BG9 turns to Haschwalth as he too is beheaded, his oil splashing all over the floor and walls. BG9's head lands at Haschwalth's feet, and his eye dims and crackles before fading out of life. So there you have it, Soi Fon and OMAEDA versus BG9. Like I said, this is Soi Fon's only fight in the 1000-Year Blood War arc, so it does beg the question, is this the final battle she deserved? Honestly, probably not. Although Soi Fon does technically win in the end, it's not the best showing for her, mostly just because of how short it is and how limited in scope her ability set appears to be in this fight. She's totally outmatched and demolished by her opponent in a matter of pages. When you sit down to think about the timeline of this battle, her defeat is shockingly fast, occurring almost immediately after her arrival. She never even tries to use her Shikai, which is odd. The anime shows her trying to use it against BG9 in the first invasion, but it just doesn't work. Why is never really elaborated upon, but it could simply be because BG9 is robotic, or because Soi Fon strikes a tendril as opposed to his actual body. Either way, while Soi Fon does get some cool moments here, her initial arrival and blitzing BG9 with Shunko, it's just not her best outing, and she did deserve another shot later on, which she unfortunately didn't get. Conversely, however, for OMAEDA, I do actually think this is a pretty good send-off as far as his major fights go. Although he doesn't really accomplish much when it comes to combat, it was never really expected of him anyway. Instead, his character transforms in a great way in this fight, and it's this new metal that later drives him to rescue both his fallen captain and little sister. Seeing him working side by side with Soi Fon is very rewarding. It's a bit of a shame that their dynamic then devolves after this back to being merely comedic, with Soi Fon punching OMAEDA in the face for every little thing. But for the most part, this fight really does a lot for OMAEDA as a character. If the anime does choose to expand on Soi Fon's role in the upcoming final battle even just a little bit, I'm certainly going to be all for that. But that's it for the video, guys. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know, of course, in the comments down below. What do you think of Soi Fon and OMAEDA versus BG9? How would you have changed this fight? Would you have made it longer? Would you have given Soi Fon the guaranteed kill? Maybe at some point she tries to use Nigeki Kesatsu. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think this is a fitting final battle for Soi Fon, or would you have rather seen her get another chance to shine later on down the line? And what do you think of OMAEDA in this battle as well? What do you think of his character development and the development of his dynamic with Soi Fon? Which version of the fight do you prefer, the animes or the source materials? I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments below. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support the channel. Until next time, guys, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.